My name is Bryony Lever. I'm a career and business coach. I moved into coaching about 4 years ago after changing careers from having worked in the mining industry for 20 years. And one of the reasons I love doing these sorts of sessions is that I spent the last 3 years repositioning myself using my story, my professional brand, LinkedIn, networking, and reworking my profile and my bio so that I could position myself in the career that I've chosen to move into. And a lot of the work that I do with my clients who are mid-level and senior women, largely in very technical positions, is helping them to reposition themselves through the way that they communicate about themselves. And one of the challenges that I see so often is that women, not just women actually, most of my clients struggle to communicate their value. They are incredibly good at their technical work, and then they are thrust into a strategic position and struggle to communicate themselves in a more strategic way. And so a lot of the work that I've done over the last 4 years has been CV writing for my coaching clients, working with them on their LinkedIn profiles, working with them on their LinkedIn strategies, and helping them show up so that they are seen as leaders in their networks and they become the person to know rather than being the person who's always trying to get to know others. So I'm going to talk a little bit more broadly because there is so much more in your toolbox than just your CV and your LinkedIn profile. And I really think it's important to think about, firstly, why you want to be on a board before you start positioning yourself for a board. And secondly, how to make yourself known through various different mechanisms other than just your CV. So the first thing I really want to put in your kind of headspace is, are you ready to be an impactful board member? And I ask this because I hear so many people wanting to be a board member, but often misperceiving what it means to be a board member. And if you're going to take the time to position yourself to get onto a board, you're doing it because you want to be impactful. And being a director, being a board member is not a sexy thing to do. It's actually really hard work. And so the things that I really think and that I advise all of my clients to think about before they start looking at positioning themselves for board membership is, firstly, if you're going to be impactful, there's going to be a time commitment to this. A lot of us think, well, being a board member means attending 4 meetings a year. There's a hell of a lot more to it than that. And some of the research shows that impactful board members spend, on average, 250 hours a year working on board-related work. 250 hours is just over a month worth of work. So that's a big time commitment to be taking on. So the first question from my perspective is, are you in a position where you have that time available and where you can commit that time? Because being a member of a board is an influential position and it has an impact on your professional brand as well. So you want to be able to do it right. Second thing is, are you ready for the fiduciary responsibilities that come with being a board member? The financial responsibilities, the liability that comes with that, the governance responsibilities, the ethics, and all the other elements of being a board member that often we don't think about clearly until suddenly we're on a board and find out what we're in for. And again, I say this because I've met a few people in the last few years who very quickly put themselves forward to be directors and all of a sudden found out the hard way that they've actually put themselves in the path of some massive liabilities and weren't prepared for that. They hadn't had the mentoring and the coaching to do a good job and suddenly found themselves taking on liabilities that they really weren't ready for and didn't know to expect. Next thing I want you to think about when you're thinking about whether you are ready to be impactful as a board member is, do you have the qualifications and experience? Board members or boards are looking for people who have substantial years of experience, who have been where the company is wanting to go and can help lead and direct the company. So a certain level of experience, a certain level of qualifications, and the behaviors of board members are critical when boards are looking for new board members. And this, the BEACS acronym that I've got there is, it stands for behaviors, experience, aptitude, knowledge, and skills. And when you're thinking about your readiness to be a board member, it's not just, have you got the years of experience? It's not just, have you got the qualifications? It's, do you have the aptitude for strategic, risk, related conversations, for making decisions, for contributing to big picture decisions for organizations? And do you have the behavioral competencies around the types of conversations that you have on a board, the way in which you engage at a strategic level, and the ability to not just speak your mind, but to listen and to be curious and to engage with people at a very strategic level. And then the final point that I want to make on this slide is realistic expectations around how long it takes to get a seat on the board. And often what we're seeing is it can take between a year and 2 years to position yourself to be invited onto a board. And it takes many, many interviews and conversations and networking and building relationships. So the process of recruiting for boards is quite different to the process for recruiting for executive positions. And I think recognizing the time that it takes and the amount of time and effort that it requires you to put in to position yourself correctly is something that's worth keeping in mind. What kind of boards can you contribute to? That's the second thing to think about when you're positioning yourself. There are many different types of organizations that you can be a board member on, and boards are going to look for people who have the experience that they're looking for in the board. So often when boards are looking for new board members, they'll put together a matrix of the skills that they've got on the board, and they'll identify the gaps that they've got in the board, and then they will start looking for people who fill those gaps. And your experience needs to be able to translate into the role that they're looking to fill on the board, the industry that the organization sits in, and the stage in the business life cycle of that organization. So are you in a position where you're trying to put yourself forward for a board that's in a startup, or a business that's quite mature, a business that's listed, or a small organization that's still growing? Being clear on the stage of the business life cycle that you want to be involved in, and that you have the experience to support and guide and grow the organization, is quite critical. Because boards are going to look for people who are already one step ahead of where the organization is. I think the second thing that boards are looking for is people who are interested in the industries that those companies are in, that have passion for the business and are really there to care for and grow the organization, not just to be a seat on a board. And so your interest and your passion needs to be able to align with the business and the challenges and the needs that it has. And being able to articulate and vocalize your interests and your passions is one of the first ways that boards start to notice you. And so that leads me on to talking about, are you on anybody's radar? And what I mean by this is, do people know that you exist? And at a time like this, where we are stuck behind our computers, isolating in our homes, it's very hard to attend conferences, and it's very hard to attend networking events. And so events like this are wonderful, But what we have at our disposal are platforms like LinkedIn. And that is one of the best places to make sure that you get yourself onto people's radar. LinkedIn is the equivalent of an online conference. It runs 24/7, 365. There's 600 million people on it. There are about 600,000 board members on LinkedIn. And taking an intentional approach on LinkedIn to connect with people, both existing in your network and people who are connected to people that you know. Doing intentional searches on LinkedIn to find the board members of the organizations that you want to position yourself in front of. LinkedIn gives you that opportunity. And when I talk about LinkedIn as an online conference, there are 3 components to LinkedIn that I think are really important to think about. The first is your profile on LinkedIn. If you think about a conference, the equivalent of your profile on LinkedIn is a stand at the conference. So your organization pays to have a stand, or you pay a ticket to be at the conference. That's your profile on LinkedIn. So if you're not on LinkedIn, you're not at the conference. Okay, that's the first thing. How you write your profile is important, because how you write it in terms of keywords and being found by people who are looking for people with your experience, looking for potential board members, that all comes down to writing a profile that intrigues people and is informative and encourages them to stay on your profile and engage in a conversation with you. Second part of it is writing your profile in a way that is full of keywords so that you are findable and searchable. And so being able to write your profile so that your stand at the conference is in the front line and not right at the back of the passageway where nobody's ever going to go is important. The second component of LinkedIn is your engagement on LinkedIn. And if you are at a conference and it's in between the keynote speeches and presentations and so on, you would be having conversations with people, and you would be handing out your business card and talking about your interests and engaging around the discussion points. And the equivalent of that on LinkedIn is engaging in conversation. So commenting on people's posts, sharing people's posts, adding your thoughts to other people's content. And that's your ticket into a conversation. It's the easiest way to be showing up in your network and have people going, here's somebody, here's Esther making a valuable point. Here's Esther adding some value to this conversation. Here's Esther sharing my content. Here's somebody that I want to have another conversation with. Here's Esther giving me her opinion and showing up as a thought leader in her network. And that starts to get people interested in who you are and what else you have to say. And the third component of the conference or on LinkedIn is the content that you share. And the content that you create yourself by way of posts and by way of articles is you taking control of your narrative. It's you starting to share your knowledge and your expertise and your ability to position yourself as an expert in your network. And anybody who is looking for new board members tends to go to LinkedIn to see, do you have a profile on LinkedIn? Do you engage regularly? Do you put your thoughts and opinions and your expertise into your network? Are you engaging with others? And are you being intentional in the way that you connect with people? So is your network filled with people that are influential, that are in good positions, that are going to be able to make an impact in your life and business, and vice versa? If your profile on LinkedIn hasn't been touched in the last year or two, it immediately raises questions about how intentional you are and how proactive you are in positioning yourself. And so before you even worry about your CV, you need to make sure that you're showing up on LinkedIn and on other platforms and creating the narrative, controlling your narrative and articulating who you are as a brand. Boards tend not to appoint people that they don't know. Boards often look for introductions to people through relationships that they already have. And it's the same the other way around. So the question for you is, what relationships do you have that you can leverage? And doing a stakeholder analysis of your network, the people that you know in person, the people that you know on LinkedIn, to identify who already serves on a board, who is connected to CEOs on boards that interest you, and who can make those introductions, is a critical part of you leveraging your network and intentionally having conversations with people who will be able to make introductions for you, with people who already know other people on the boards that interest you. This is all part of your networking strategy and part of intentionally building the relationships that are going to take you down that journey over the next year or two to get you onto the boards that interest you. And so often we focus on our technical expertise, but it's not what you know as much as it is who you know. So who are the relationships? And more these days, it's becoming less about who you know and who knows you. So once you've identified those relationships, how can you leverage them by serving the people in your network? What I observed in some of the CVs that were sent to me was that these are CVs that are quite long. So a lot of the CVs were 8 pages long, 4 to 8 pages. And immediately when anybody sees a CV that's anything more than about a page or 2, you have to spend time interpreting and reading the document to find the information that you're looking for. So the first thing that recruiters and boards are going to look for is a short CV that's to the point and immediately tells them what they need to know. Recruiters go immediately to look for the CVs of people who are able to articulate their value very quickly. It's critical to understand that the way recruitment takes place these days is through scanning of CVs. And the applicant tracking systems can't easily read graphics, icons, tables, text boxes, all sorts of fancy stuff that we put into our CVs to make them visually interesting. And if you can't get your CV past the applicant tracking system, your CV is not going to get to a human being. So a CV that is short and to the point, and a CV that can get through the applicant tracking system is one step ahead of any CV that looks pretty and is very long and full of information. What boards are looking for is quite different to what employers look for in terms of executives. So executives need to be able to show that they can work through people. Their management abilities are important. Their technical abilities are important. What boards are looking for is your ability to make strategic decisions, to make tough decisions, to deal with risk, and to be able to represent the organization and manage its brand and reputation in a way that upholds the values of the organization. And so the resume that they're looking for is going to speak to your exposure to leadership. So how much leadership experience have you had? In what kind of positions have you had that leadership? How much work have you done in terms of mentoring and coaching other people to grow the skills in an organization? How much profit and loss responsibility have you had? Have you had direct responsibility for profit and loss, or have you had a secondary responsibility for that? They're going to look for your governance knowledge and experience. So how clued up you are in terms of fiduciary responsibilities, in terms of governance and ethics, and in terms of the way businesses run. They're going to look for your board and management experience. And that could be having sat on boards before. It could be having reported to boards. It could be having been involved in a committee. It could be having submitted documentation that informs boards. It doesn't necessarily have to have been a board seat, but having had relationships with boards and have been in the boardroom in some form or another is important. And then the final thing they look for is your specialty or your technical experience that immediately says you understand the language of the industry that the organization sits in. And sometimes boards look for experience from other industries, but there has to be some level of parallel. And so being very clear on the experience that you bring, the technical experience that you bring, that communicates your ability to understand the language and the nuances and the challenges of an organization is quite critical to very quickly becoming an impactful board member. And the way in which you put that across in your resume is critical. What boards are looking for is demonstration of your experience. Less on saying you have the experience and more on giving tangible evidence. So I see a lot of CVs where people put their roles and responsibilities and their KPIs on their CVs and don't focus on providing the tangible evidence of, and so when I talk about tangible evidence, what I'm talking about is describing a situation where you've had a responsibility, what actions you took, and what the outcomes were in terms of dollars saved, budget spent, funds raised, schedules met, deadlines advanced on, people employed, people's jobs saved, impact of spend on community, on stakeholder, on environment, whatever the mission is of the organization. And being able to quantify as much as possible gives a sense of the level of complexity that you've had responsibility for. It gives a sense of the scope that you've had responsibility for in terms of decision making. And it gives a sense of the variety of experiences and the complexity of experiences. And what we so often get caught up in when we're writing our own resumes is that we know what we've done and we assume others know what we've done. And it's really important to be able to differentiate yourself from everybody else by being explicit in describing the experience that you've had and the achievements and the contributions that you've made to organizations. Any organization that has an international representation is going to look for a CV that's 1 to 2 pages long. You can always supplement that with additional information. A board is always going to look for a short, to-the-point CV or resume that speaks directly to what the board is looking for. And that is not so much the detail of how you are able to do the technical job. It's more about how you are able to lead and guide and make decisions. And if you can communicate your value directly and briefly, what that communicates to a board is that you are able to articulate yourself and position yourself very succinctly and to the point. And that's what boards are looking for, is direct and to the point communications. your half-life of your experience is really short these days. And anything beyond 10 years is probably not relevant to the position that you're going for, and it's certainly not relevant to a board position. So focus on your most recent experience, and focus on what is most relevant to that particular board. So you may have experience across retail and mining and insurance and NGOs, but if you're applying for a board position in retail, focus on your retail experience and any other experience that translates well into retail. Don't focus on things that are irrelevant to that particular industry's challenges. Committees are things like social and ethics committees, social and ethics, remuneration committees, recruitment committees. Boards appoint people in committees to do the research and to come up with position papers that boards can then make the decision on. If you can put your hand up to be on a board-appointed committee, that's one level closer to being on the board, because your communication is directly to the board. It's communication around issues that the board is directly interested in, and it indicates that you have the ability to engage at a board level. So if you can't get onto a board, then in your organization, find out what committees are constituted by the board and put your hand up to be nominated onto one of those committees. That is probably one of the best ways to level up your experience so that you get closer to board experience. If you are uncomfortable with social media, how do you navigate social media? I used to be very scared of social media and what I would put up there. And so my starting point was not to share my own content. My starting point was just to engage in other people's conversations. And if you are going to do anything on social media, focus on LinkedIn. That's the professional networking site. Don't get caught up in Instagram and Facebook and YouTube and anything else if you don't want to. You're not required to be there, and you're not really required to be on LinkedIn. But the way that recruitment works is every time you submit your CV, a recruiter is going to go straight to LinkedIn to see if you're there. So you're actually putting yourself at a disadvantage if you aren't on LinkedIn. And if you aren't active on LinkedIn, there is absolutely no point being on LinkedIn, because you're actually going to do your brand a disservice by being half on LinkedIn and not being active. My suggestion here is have a profile on LinkedIn that is authentic to you. You don't have to be out there and sharing things every single day, and you don't have to be overly personal. In fact, I don't think you should be overly personal, but you do need to have a profile that creates the narrative for you, because if you aren't controlling your story, somebody else will be controlling your story. So create your own story and tell it in a way that's authentic to you. There will be some people who don't like it, and that's fine, because if they don't like working with you, you're not going to enjoy working with them. It's going to help attract the people that you're actually going to work well with. And then the second point is it can be very overwhelming to create your own content. I completely understand that. The easiest way to have presence on LinkedIn is to identify 20 or 30 people that you think are leaders in the areas that you want to be known for. And then follow them or connect with them. And when they post content, comment on their content. And that's the equivalent of joining people who are having a conversation and every now and again saying, yeah, I really like what you said there. Or can you elaborate on that? And as you start to warm up the conversation, then you can share your own opinion. So once you've built up your confidence, then start sharing your own content. And if it takes you years to build up your confidence, that's absolutely fine. But I can almost guarantee that every single person in this room has expertise in something that they can talk about. And you can start by just saying, I attended this conference, or I'm presenting this paper, or I listened to that podcast. And that's a starting point. And what that does is it says, this is something I'm interested in. And if you do that regularly enough, people start to see a theme. So my advice is always pick 3 to 5 topics that you want to be known for, and only talk about those topics. Only engage with other people who talk about those topics, and only share content on those topics. And very quickly, people will start to associate you with those topics. And instead of diluting your brand by talking about absolutely everything, what you're doing is focusing your brand around the few things that you really want to be known for. And it takes away the overwhelm of having to be involved in every single conversation. So is there too much? If I wouldn't say this in person, I'm not going to say it on a public platform. And I think the danger of social media is that we so often think we're talking to our immediate circle of friends. Then we actually realize that what we've put on social media can be found by absolutely anybody. Every time I put something onto social media, I immediately think, if this gets found in 5 years' time, am I going to be comfortable with it? If this gets seen by the board that I want to go and talk to, is it going to be relevant to them? Is there a way that I can control this? It very much depends on the industry that you're in. So I think you need to make sure that it's aligned with the tone of the industry that you work in. And that's really all I can say. That's the only other thing is be authentic to yourself. Bring your personality and your whole self to everything that you do, because often what people are looking for is the person behind the image. And your CV can only convey a small amount of information. And social media can either be your friend in giving the whole sense of who you are and what you stand for, or it can be your enemy if you aren't clear on who you are and what you stand for. And I mean, you get to a point where actually you're interviewing organizations and boards to see if you want to work with them, not the other way around. And so again, social media can be a great way of sending all of those people away who you actually wouldn't want to work with anyway, and attracting all of the people who align with you in how you work, what you believe, what you value, what you tolerate, and what you don't tolerate. There's always going to be the formal channels of communication and the informal channels of communication. And when you start positioning yourself for a board position, you need to be able to navigate both of those. You need to be able to navigate politics in and outside of organizations. And it's a critical requirement of anybody who's on a board. So learning to navigate that politics and identify who are the people in the formal channels as well as the informal channels that you need to know, that you need to be building strong relationships with, and who ultimately make the decisions. It's a critical skill. If you can't navigate politics, don't put yourself forward for a board. To me, it's as easy as that. And politics doesn't have to be dramatic, but you do have to be very slick in being able to navigate formal and informal communication channels so that you're getting the information that you need, so that you're not left behind sitting there going, how did I not know this? And if that's something that you're uncomfortable with, it may be a skill that you need to start developing now, because so often I hear people say, I don't want to get caught up in the politics, I just want to do my work. If that's your mantra, you're not ready for a board position yet, because boards are politics. Get coaching and mentoring on how to navigate those conversations before you put yourself in a position to sit on a board, because your first board position is either going to make or break you. You're either going to hate it and never put yourself forward for a board again, or you're going to thrive. And a lot of that for the first few kind of meetings is really listening and getting a sense of how do decisions get made on this board? Who are the people who actually make the decisions? Are the decisions being made in this room, or is there a whole bunch of lobbying going on outside of this room? And how do I get into that lobbying? Because that goes back to being impactful. If you are only wanting to be on a board in order to say I'm on a board, very different to wanting to make an impact. Board experience gets you more opportunities for board experience, but it's the same thing. If you have no experience, how do you get experience? And my suggestion here is, if you've had no exposure to boards, the first thing you need to do is start putting your hand up and volunteering, okay? Putting your hand up in your organization to be nominated onto committees, to take on bigger work, to attend networking events so that you can get exposure to people that perhaps you're not getting exposure to at the moment. Volunteering in your professional bodies, in your industry, because what that does is catapult you into relationships with people that perhaps you ordinarily wouldn't have access to. And then the final comment here is, we all aspire to sit on the really impressive boards, but it takes a lot of time and a lot of experience to get to those. So if you get offered a position with a small company in an industry that's not particularly exciting, it's still a foot in the door to getting board experience. And so my advice is, take the non-sexy board position to get your foot in the door and get the experience. Because once you've got one board position, it becomes a lot easier to get the next board position. And then the final thing I wanted to say is, there are a lot of resources out there that you can leverage. So I don't know who here is a member of Boardroom Africa. That is definitely something to consider joining. They put women forward to boards across Africa, and they provide a lot of training and a lot of mentorship and a lot of guidance, and it's a great network to be involved in. There's the 30% Club, which I believe has a chapter in Nairobi. I'm not sure how active they are, but again, it's an organization that's internationally represented, and it's a great way to get some access to leadership courses and to get exposure to other women who are decision makers in organizations and who are mentoring and coaching people to become board members. And then the final one is the Institute of Directors, and pretty much every single country has an Institute of Directors, and they generally offer fantastic director training. And you don't have to be a director to sign up for their director training. That training gives you exposure to the governance and ethics and the practices of boards and how to be a director. And it also gives you access to a network of organizations that are looking for directors. So if you do nothing else, investigate those as ways of leveraging up your experience and your knowledge and your network. Being on a board is a big commitment, and it can give you access to very influential people, and it can give you a position of power and exposure, but it comes at a cost. And it comes at a cost of your time. It comes at a cost of exposure to liabilities. And it comes at a cost of exposure to risk. But when you're in a position where you have time and there is an organization that you believe you can be impactful with and for, and where you can make a difference that aligns with what you value, what's important to you, and what you want to be committed to, being on a board can be incredibly valuable to your career, to your network, and to your ability to get more powerful positions. So I think there's huge value to it. But I think you've got to be ready. And that's why I started with my first slide of, are you ready to be on a board? Being on a board, as I said right at the beginning, is not just attending 4 meetings a year. There is so much more to it. And if you don't make an impact as a board member, it can set you back in your senior level network. So do it with intention and with the knowledge of what you're exposing yourself to. For me, LinkedIn is one of the most effective ways of attracting like-minded people to you. And if you put into your network that you are looking for other women that you can chat to about their board experiences and managing boards and setting up boards, I can almost guarantee you that people will be making connections for you very quickly. As women, we take on a hell of a lot and we expect a hell of a lot of ourselves. And you don't have to do it all at the same time. There is more than enough time in our lives and our careers to finish one phase and then put ourselves forward for board memberships at another point in time. I think so often we get caught up in this need to be everything to everybody and be involved in so many things. And my personal philosophy, after having burnt myself out really badly because I was trying to be involved in too many things, is to have a plan for a year or two and do really well at what I'm doing in that year or two. And then in another couple of years, set my sights on the next thing. And if you become a board member, it doesn't mean you have to be a board member for the rest of your life. It can be something that you do for 2 or 3 years and then you move on to the next thing. There are so many options. It doesn't have to be corporate boards, NPOs and schools and churches and community organizations that are all looking for board members. When I said start small, look at your easy foot in the door that starts giving you that experience and that exposure. That for me, the biggest challenge of moving from a technical position into a board position is the change in the language that you use and the change in headspace. Because often with technical work, we're very deep diving and we get very caught up in the detail. But when you're working on a board, you have to look more integratively and across the organization, and it becomes much bigger picture, strategic, risk-based conversations, and that's a very different headspace. And so starting to think through how to navigate that transition from your technical work and being able to level it up into how does this impact on the organization, it is something to work on. And just to your point of you didn't get the position that you applied for, that's absolutely fine. There are some, as I said at the beginning, it takes a year to 2 years to get yourself onto a board. And so there's going to be many conversations before you get onto a board. Keep having the conversations and keep putting yourself out there. It's great practice for eventually being in the right conversation at the right time. So there are definitely more women getting onto boards as we move through time, and that's fantastic. The risk for women is being a single woman on a board. And there is a lot of evidence that says one woman on a board makes absolutely no difference and actually impacts on her influence negatively. Okay? 2 people on a board tend to clash with each other, and the minimum you want on a board is 3 women. So If you are finding that you're being invited onto a board and you are the sole woman, it can be a very difficult position to be in. You definitely want to make sure that you are at least one of two and optimally one of three or more. At the moment, I think some of the listed companies are now saying you have to have one woman on board, with the introduction of two over the course of the next couple years. And my concern with that is that because of the legislation or the guidelines, it becomes something that people aim to comply to as a tick box, as opposed to going, at what point do women become most impactful? And the research says when there's three or more. So any guidelines that say you have to have two is often going to stimulate decisions that say, okay, we've got our two women now we don't need any more. So understanding what the organization's philosophy is around women on boards, whether they subscribe to a tick box exercise, and how women cascade through the organizations as well is really important, because that's going to speak to structural issues in the organization. It's going to speak to mindset issues in the organization. It's going to speak to institutional bias, and understanding all of that gives you insights into how you're going to be treated. It's very inspiring when women create their own tables, and that's what you've done here, is create your own table and bring people to your party. I wouldn't have had this exposure to all of these wonderful women across Africa, so thank you for inviting me, and I'm always happy to talk with women and be part of a conversation.